Okay, so we're going to talk about World War II, specifically the home front. So, referring, of course, to like what are we doing domestically to help support the war? So, think of like, there's a couple different fronts or theaters in World War II. Of course, we have the Pacific Theater with Japan, we have the European Theater or front with Germany. And so, this is the home front, what we're doing to help support our troops overseas. And this set of notes is brought to you by the AP US History test. Specifically, there was an LEQ, or a long essay question, back in the 2009 test, which reads as follows. Excuse me. All right, analyze the home front experiences of two of the following groups during the Second World War. And so African, Japanese, Jewish, Mexican Americans. So they more or less said, pick two and tell me, what were they doing during World War II? And so that's kind of how we're going to deal with these notes. We're going to do kind of one chunk at a time. And then after we look at these minority groups, we're also going to look and see what women are doing. We're going to look at our economy kind of ramping up for World War II. And then we're going to look at some propaganda. So that's kind of the name of the game for today. Right, so as I mentioned, we're going to go through minority groups first. So we'll look at Mexican Americans, okay? So one of the things to keep in mind is the Brasiero program. So this went from 1942 until 1964. And the whole idea is while Americans are off fighting overseas, we're going to have a system of kind of replacement workers. And so the idea is Mexican farm workers were allowed to enter the United States in the harvest season without any formal immigration procedures in order to cover kind of wartime shortages. And so we can see, they're kind of checking in here. They're getting sprayed to make sure they aren't bringing lice or anything with them into the United States. Like I said, this does stick around after the war until 1964, kind of recovering labor shortages. Over here, we have some pictures. We have, some Brasiero farmers, farmhands. This is kind of the bunks they would get, and they'd travel from farm to farm during harvest season. And then we have a fine-looking Brasiero farmer there. Also, just kind of talking about their service in World War II. Over 300,000 served in the armed forces. They had the highest percentage of Congressional Medal of Honor winners than any other ethnic group. So just kind of talking a little bit about their service in the armed forces. Something else that was happening in Los Angeles specifically during the war were something called Zoot Suit riots. Well, let's take this one part at a time. So here's a zoot suit. You can see that this style, very popular among the teenagers, the Mexican-American teenagers, uses a ton of fabric. And because you can see the excessive pleating here, for example, these suits were seen as very unpatriotic. So during World War II, we're rationing everything, trying to cut corners to help our boys overseas. These zoot suits were really kind of seen as kind of a slap in the face to everyone else who's rationing. And so the rioting starts. So 1943, at least the summer of 1943, what we'll see are U.S. sailors, specifically in Los Angeles, start to go around and literally beat up any teenage boy they see wearing zoot suits. And so these riots are kind of breaking out across the summer of 1943. And so finally, the city of Los Angeles outlawed the wearing of zoot suits in public altogether to try to stem the flood of these riots. And so you can see here they are, Sheriff's Department of Los Angeles County rounding up all those zoot suit bedecked teenagers. And so that's a little bit of Mexican Americans, the Brasiero program, the zoot suit riots, that sort of thing. All right. Next, we have African Americans. And so during World War II, kind of their campaign was called the Double V campaign. So you can see these guys, putting up the V sign, the peace sign, the victory sign. And the idea is it was victory over fascism abroad, So, right, like fascism, like Mussolini in Italy, Tojo in Japan, Hitler in Germany. So, victory over fascism abroad, but also victory over discrimination at home. And the idea being, of course, that we'll kind of flip the picture here, that you can see, win the war, plan the peace. That if they were to fight and work hard and really kind of prove their American heritage and their fighting spirit, that they would kind of win a place among American society, kind of increase their standing in American society. All right, so you can see, the Negro press, win the war, plan the peace, backing the attack on all fronts. And so that was kind of the general campaign, if you will, during World War II. Also, discrimination in general is going to continue in housing and employment. We're still going to have the Jim Crow laws in the South, despite, the African Americans who are fighting in the war. We also have the second Great Migration. I think this kid is having a good day, don't you think? He looks like he's having a good day. But the second Great Migration, much like the first migration, was a movement of African Americans from the South to the North and to the West. And so about 1 million African Americans found defensive jobs or jobs, building munitions, that sort of thing, in the North and on the West Coast. And so the Second Great Migration attached to the Second World War, First Migration connected to the First World War. Okay, so talking about African Americans actually fighting in the war, we see over 1 million African Americans are going to join the armed forces. It's still going to be segregated, but they do have fairer treatment than in the First World War. So, for example, we're going to see Benjamin Davis here. He's going to be the first Black general commissioned in the Army, so very famous. And then over here, this guy right here, Dory Miller, is going to be kind of a hero of Pearl Harbor. And his picture is going to be used in a lot of recruitment posters. The idea is he was actually a cook third class aboard one of the naval ships when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And so he saved a number of lives, risking his own life, kind of helping injured men, moving them to safety. He is sadly going to die a couple years into the war. One of the ships he's serving on is going to be attacked and sunk by a Japanese sub. But he is kind of this hero of Pearl Harbor, and so used kind of to help recruit other African Americans to join. Another kind of group of African Americans serving in the armed forces were the Tuskegee Airmen, also known as the Black Eagles. And you can see some photos of them here. So just to kind of review a little bit, remember Tuskegee is a college or an institute in Alabama. Remember Booker T. Washington had formed that. And so the Tuskegee Airmen were actually first trained at the Tuskegee Institute, I believe in Alabama. And then about 3,000 pilots served during World War II. And despite the fact that, they're risking their lives for their country, they continued to be discriminated against. And so this lovely lady here, the first lady at the time, Eleanor Roosevelt, made sure that she would, fly with them, took pictures with them to try to support the airmen. So the Tuskegee Airmen, definitely a no-to or something to know about World War II. Another guy you ought to keep your eye on is A. Philip Randolph. There he is on a postage stamp. And so who is he? Well, he's the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So you can see car porters, meaning like railroad cars. Whoops. And really, the thing we ought to know about him is he was really concerned about African Americans getting fair access to employment, to jobs during World War II. And the idea is he was threatening a massive march on Washington to protest the fact that they were being discriminated against with regards to job opportunities. And so the idea is he was organizing kind of across the country this march on Washington. So mass meeting, must have jobs. Here, A. Philip Randolph here. And eventually what's happening is he doesn't even have to go on the march, right? The march doesn't happen. The threat of the march is enough to kind of get the president to get into action. And so last but not least, what we see in 1941 is Executive Order 8802. And this is obviously an order from the president, an order from FDR. And it's exactly what Randolph wanted. It's going to ban discrimination in defense industries and governments. It was poorly enforced, but it did lead to some changes in hiring practices. And so at least, on paper, A. Philip Randolph did get his way. And he'll stick around for a while too and be involved with kind of the civil rights movement later on. So that's a little bit of what African Americans are up to. So now we're going to look at Japanese Americans, which is the ethnic group that's probably most harshly treated during the war, okay, relatively speaking. So what's going to happen is, of course, we know Pearl Harbor is going to happen, and that's, of course, the Japanese attacking the United States Air Base. And so what's going to happen, Pearl Harbor happens December 7th, 1941, the date which shall live in infamy. And we're going to see attitudes towards Japanese Americans already going to change soon after that. So for example, right away, we're going to see 15,000 Japanese Americans arrested as security threats. And so the idea is, we don't know, maybe they're spies, maybe they're helping out the Japanese Empire, and so 15,000 are arrested right away. And then we're going to see things in popular culture really start to make fun of Japanese Americans, portraying them as really being un-Americans. And so here's a lovely Dr. Seuss campaign, right? Wipe that schneer off his face, buy war bonds and stamps. And then over here, buy some more bonds, remember Pearl Harbor, and here's Japanese treachery, December 7th, the day Pearl Harbor happened. And so we're going to see kind of just in popular culture, they're really going to be presented as being truly un-American. And then, of course, the most notorious part to all of this is Executive Order 9066. And what this is doing, it's creating internment camps. And what it did is this executive order, brought to you by the President of the United States, mandated that all, quote, dangerous persons, unquote, be moved to relocation centers. And so in all, about 112,000 Japanese Americans were moved from the West Coast and placed in these kind of internment camps. And so people with even a 1/16th Japanese heritage could be interned because we couldn't trust their loyalty during the war, and we wanted them to be away from kind of these strategic areas. And so you can kind of see, here's a map of the exclusion zone here, and then you can see the different internment camps. Assembly centers were kind of prior to internment camps, so you were sent to an assembly center first, and then you were sent to an internment camp. And of course, if you owned a business, you would have to sell your business very quickly in order to get at least some money out of your business before you were kind of sent off to one of these internment camps. And there's a video I'm going to put in the description below that I expect you to watch. Have fun with that. And I'll also put it down there, but you just have to watch about the first 9 minutes of it. So keep that in mind. There is a video I would like you to watch connected with this, but that'll be for you after this lovely video ends. Also, when it comes to fighting in the war, there was a regiment of Japanese Americans, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was composed of Japanese Americans, and they were the most decorated regiment that fought in the war. They fought in the Italian front. More on that later. And so they're fighting in the war, while at the same time their family members back in the States are interned in these camps. Eventually, what's going to happen in 1988, Congress is going to make a formal apology for these internment camps and award $20,000 to any person who was still alive that had been in those internment camps. And so about 82,000 checks are going to be written to the survivors, those who had been in these internment camps. One last thing here. Right, so Korematsu versus United States, like I said, kind of in a nutshell, what it does is it upholds the constitutionality of these internment camps, the details of this Supreme Court case are going to be in the video that you're going to watch. So I'm not going to go into too much, detail with that, but just saying, just wait for some notes on Korematsu versus United States. Well, we're going to look now at Jewish Americans. So at this time, Jewish Americans made up about 3% of the population. And there was definitely some anti-Semitism going on in the United States at the time, which means against Jewish, bad Jewish feeling. And so we're going to see during the war, about 100,000 Jews are going to enter the United States, including very famously Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with Einstein, but Fermi, he was the one who first created particle reactors. And so the Fermi Lab, which is outside of Chicago, is named in his honor. So he was, the first nuclear reactor. He came up with that. So very, very high-end scientists come to the United States kind of as refugees, if you will. All right. So an infamous thing the United States did was turn away this ship. So in 1939, the United States turned away over 900 Jewish refugees on the SS St. Louis. The idea that the ship was from Germany, full of Jewish refugees, and it first went to Cuba, but Cuba only let 28 of them ashore. And then they stop, of course, in the United States, but the United States turns away the ship. Especially thinking of the Great Depression, we didn't want to have to share our jobs. And we still had the quota system at the time, and so only a certain percentage of Germans were allowed to come into our country. And so very notoriously, the ship was sent away, ultimately had to go back to Europe, and out of about 900, about 250 of these folks are going to end up being killed in the concentration camps. And so kind of very notorious, my bad, to say the least, with American history. All right. So something we did do that was rather nice is we created Fort Ontario, which was in New York State. And it was home to about 982 Jewish refugees from 18 different countries. It was the first and only attempt by the United States to shelter Jewish refugees during the war. And so Gold Star United States for Fort Ontario, at least for the 1,000 or so Jews there, it was an attempt to offer some shelter to Jewish refugees. Another my bad sort of deal as well that we did is legislators proposed but then ultimately rejected something called the Wagner-Rogers Bill. It would have allowed an additional 20,000 German Jews who were under the age of 14 to enter the United States, but once again, that was rejected, and those 20,000 German Jews under the age of 14 had to find shelter elsewhere. All right. Another good thing we did is we created the War Refugee Board. So the War Refugee Board was created in January of 1944. And it was 2 years after reports of the Holocaust were confirmed. So we kind of knew the Holocaust was happening. And it takes us a couple of years before we try to organize really any relief with that. It is credited with saving about 150,000 Hungarian Jews. And what this board did is it's working with Jewish organizations, diplomats from neutral countries. So think of Switzerland, and other resistance groups in Europe to kind of rescue Jews from occupied territories and then to transport them into neutral countries before, they were deported to concentration camps. And so kind of organizing, working with kind of these resistance groups to kind of smuggle out Jews from these areas and putting them into neutral countries. And then also, just to kind of round us up here, about 500,000 Jews did serve in all branches of the United States Armed Forces, and even once again, serving in the Army, a lot of them faced discrimination and prejudice and anti-Semitism in general. All right, so now we're going to look at what Native Americans were doing. And so about 99% of all eligible Native Americans did register for the draft. And this set the national standard out of any of the ethnic groups. And about 44,000 served in the armed forces during World War II. And so even if they are not serving in the armed forces, a lot of Native Americans left their reservations for kind of high-paying jobs in cities that were far away from home. And so about 46,000 Indian men and women left their reservations for these defense-related jobs. Most of them that left the reservation never did return after the war. To kind of just show the patriotism that is shown, kind of a little example here was there was a football team at Santa Fe Indian School that after their homecoming game in 1942 volunteered and signed up for the armed forces. So an entire football team signed up. The thing they're perhaps best known for during World War II is their work as Navajo Code Talkers. So Navajo Code Talkers work specifically in the Pacific Front, so kind of against Japan. And each Marine Corps had a Navajo Code Talker. And the idea is that the Navajo language was so difficult for Japanese to understand that the code that was created based on this language was more or less unbreakable. And so they were able to easily learn this code that the Japanese never were actually able to break throughout the entire war. And so by war's end, about 400 Navajo served as these code talkers. And once again, there's going to be a clip that'll be linked kind of in the description below, kind of just to show you what that looked like. All right, on to women. So about 350,000 Americans did serve in uniform, both at home and abroad during the war. And they had kind of, their service had kind of different acronyms connected to it. So for example, the Women's Army was the WACs, the Women's Navy was the WAVES, the Coast Guard was the SPARS, and the Air Force were the WASPs. And so they did serve in all of those kind of different branches of the armed services. And you can see kind of them in uniform here. Of course, another role women filled was that of a factory worker. And so we're going to see Rosie the Riveter. So Rosie the Riveter is kind of one of those generic names, kind of like G.I. Joe. So Rosie the Riveter is a nickname for a woman who took jobs outside the home to kind of fill in the labor shortage while the men were off fighting. So about 6 million women did take jobs outside of the home during World War II. In fact, that was about 37% of the workforce were women during the war. And we see this symbol right here is very famous. We can do it. It's kind of the symbol of Rosie the Riveter. Also, you see a lot of Halloween costumes and memes and stuff with this. The original Rosie the Riveter was actually this one over here. The symbol of Rosie the Riveter was actually this first one over here. But this is a Norman Rockwell painting. And the idea is that there was a lot of copyright issues with using this one. And so we'll see kind of the women's rights movement later on when they're looking for like the face of Rosie the Riveter. And you can see it says Rosie here, and this is a riveting machine. So eventually when the women's rights movement wanted to use Rosie the Riveter as one of their symbols, they had to stick with this, which is kind of a lesser known image of her simply because of copyright issues. And so today, this is the one we usually connect with it. Also, there's going to be a little video of some Rosie the Riveters working away in the defense industry, and that'll be linked below. All right, so we're almost there. We're going to look at the economy and then some propaganda, and then we will be done. So with the economy, of course, the whole idea is we have to shift from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy. So we're going to see some, governmental agencies set up to help with that shift. The first one, the War Production Board, once again, it was their job to help orchestrate the shift from wartime production to wartime production. So helping the factories kind of re-gear themselves to be making, planes or tanks or whatever munitions needed to happen. So the War Production Board here, you can see right here, just to give you some numbers, they helped to produce about 40 billion bullets, 300,000 planes, 76,000 ships, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, and you can see the War Productions Board had quite the job in front of them to kind of help orchestrate the shift into wartime production. So obviously you don't need to know those numbers, you don't need to know that there are 40 billion bullets, but just so you can kind of get a sense of how big a job this really was. All right. The Office of Price Administration. So really the idea here is this is going to be doing kind of really two things. First thing they're doing is they're going to help combat inflation, because keep in mind, people now have money, right? We had just gone from the Great Depression where people had no money to now people have jobs, people have money in their pockets and they want to spend it. So there's going to be this huge demand for goods. And so it'd be really easy for realtors, for people who are selling stuff, to jack up the price because so many people want that new radio or they want that new car. And so it would have been really easy for those companies to jack up the price. But this group was trying to help combat inflation. They also set up rationing. So rationing coupons, you see one here, on what were considered to be critical goods. So like meat, butter, gas, tires, typewriters, all of those things were rationed. So not only did you have to buy the meat with money, but you also had to produce certain rationing coupons to kind of prove that you aren't overbuying these things. So here's like a ration stamp. And once again, there's a little video connected to this that I'll link below. All right, the National War Labor Board. And yes, something like this definitely existed during World War I, but the purpose was to arbitrate disputes between workers and employers so that there would be no strikes, or at least as few strikes as possible, to ensure that labor was reliable and productive during the war. So once again, you have your kind of blue collar worker here, your welder perhaps, and then you have the manager and the United States here like, hey, let's get along because our boys overseas really need our help. So get behind your labor management committee. So this is very similar to something we had in World War I. All right, next is the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act. And so exactly what it sounds like, it's going to allow the federal government to seize and operate industries that were threatened by or under strikes that would interfere with war production. And so the whole idea is we don't want strikes. So say if the coal industry were to go into a strike, well, the United States could literally kind of like nationalize the coal industry, at least temporarily, more or less take over the coal industry to make sure that the mining of coal wasn't interrupted due to a strike in the war. Or same thing, I don't know, with the welders. Why not the welders? So if the welders union went on strike or something to that effect, the government could literally go and take over that industry to make sure that production wasn't affected by any strike. So we'll see a couple pictures here. FDR, still president, actually vetoes this, and then the veto is overridden by Congress. And so to pass something, you have to have a simple majority, 50% of Congress has to approve of it. But if the president vetoes it, then 2/3 of Congress has to approve it, or supermajority. And so we have here, millions, where's my mouse? Millions of fed up Americans. And then here we have the president with the bill. Should I sign it? Should I not? Well, he's taking advice from political influence, and he says, better not sign it, Frank. I don't like it. And so he does veto it. But as we can see over here, Congress is going to override the veto of the anti-strike bill. And so that's a little bit of what's going on in the economy. All right, last but not least, we're going to look at some propaganda. All right, so specifically the government, the group in the government that's in charge of propaganda is the Office of War Information. So yeah, they're known mostly for propaganda, kind of to support the war effort, but they also did help connect civilians to information. And so that definitely was a part of it. The idea is they would have radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, posters, photographs, all sorts of media that was supposed to connect the average citizen to what's going on, in the battlefront. But like I said, they're really mostly known as, leading the charge for some propaganda. And so we're just going to look at a couple of posters. Not all of these were created by the Office of War Information, but a number of them were, so you kind of get the point. And so you can see material conservation, right? So don't waste your goods. And this is the Jap trap, right? So that is the face of the Emperor of Japan, or I shouldn't say the Emperor of Japan, the leader of Japan being snapped there by material conservation. And then over here on the right, loose lips sink or might sink ships, meaning you never know where there's a spy about you. So you better not tell me, what Johnny wrote home and said he was doing overseas. If you know something, stay quiet, because there might be spies amongst us. So loose lips, talking too much might sink ships. All right, here's some other ones. Wanted for murder. For her careless talk costs lives. So same idea. She's jabbing away and there's a spy, and now all of a sudden everybody's dead. That's what happens, people. That's what happens. And then here's another one. Longing won't bring him back sooner. Get a war job. See, you're a U.S. Employment Service. So Rosie, you go, you become a riveter. Help Johnny come back home safe. Oh, these are some fun ones. Victory waits on your fingers. Keep 'em flying, Miss USA. So here you go. Uncle Sam needs typers. This cartoon was actually on the AP test like a couple of years ago. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's that cartoon. The end. Oh, on the right, here you go. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. I don't even know what to say with that. But you should join a car sharing club today. Don't waste that gas when you and your buddy could both drive to work together. Okay, so I'll also link some propaganda that was in kind of film below. So there's a couple of examples of like Walt Disney and kind of using some propaganda against Hitler, against the Nazis, poking fun at them. And so you don't have to watch those in their fullness, but just watch a couple of minutes of each one to kind of get the idea that even like little kid cartoons had some propaganda involved. And so just to kind of review, what we did is we looked at the home front. We started to look at some minority groups like Mexican Americans, like African Americans, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, Native Americans. And then we looked at women, the economy, and propaganda. And like I said, please do watch those clips that I linked below. If there's a certain time frame of the video I'd like you to watch, I marked those as well. So I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.